we're stepping officially to policymaking. We're going to start with fiscal policies. In the United States, it is important to make a distinction between the government and the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States. In many countries, central banks are considered part of the government, not in the United States though. In the United States, when we talk about the government, it refers to the federal, the state, and the local government. It refers to the executive branch, which is the president, the White House, the legislative branch, the Congress, and the judicial branch, the court system. So those are the entities that we include when we talk about the government. The Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States, is not part of the government. It is an important policy-making agency, but it is not part of the government. In fact, by Constitution, it is supposed to act independently of the government. So, when it comes to policymaking, there are two types of policies: fiscal policies and monetary policies. So, fiscal policies are devised and conducted by the government. So here, let's discuss fiscal policies. Obviously, there are many fiscal policy tools. For example, if the government provides some subsidies or some incentives for household members to use solar panels, to install solar panel, that is a form of fiscal policy tool. If the government decides to give companies some credits or some incentive to make investment in certain sector, that is also a form of fiscal policy tool. So there are many types of fiscal policy tools. But here we are going to discuss only three. We're going to focus on three policy tools, and all of them have been introduced to us, so we are familiar with them. They are government spending, income taxes, and transfer payments. So previously, when we talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we have familiarized ourselves with how each one of these fiscal policy tools can affect the aggregate demand. For example, as the government spending increases, aggregate demand increases. As the income taxes lower, aggregate demand increases. As transfer payment is increased, we are likely to see a change in an increase in aggregate demand. So we have talked about the qualitative effect of each one of these fiscal policy tools. So that makes our job slightly easier today. We are just going to focus on the quantitative effect of each one of these policy tools. So each one of these policy tools will have impact on the aggregate demand. Specifically, it will have multiplier effect on the aggregate demand. So as we have discussed earlier when we covered spending multiplier, it's not really a one-to-one relationship. Okay? So with government spending, because government spending is a component of aggregate demand by itself, so we can apply the spending multiplier that we have just learned, 1 over MPS plus MPI. Okay? Or alternatively, you can also use 1 over 1 minus MPC plus MPI. Okay? So that is not new. Okay? We have talked about that in the previous chapter. What is new is the income tax multiplier and transfer payment multiplier. With income tax and transfer payment, we cannot apply the spending multiplier we have learned before, because income tax and transfer payments are not a component of aggregate demand by itself. So therefore, we need to modify the spending multiplier a little bit, because each one of these, income tax and transfer payment, will affect aggregate demand through consumption. So the effect is not as direct. Obviously, we're not going to go over the derivations of these formulas, but the intuition underlying this multiplier is very similar to what we have discussed when we talk about some of the intuition underlying the formula of spending multiplier. Okay? So for income tax multiplier, that's the negative of MPC minus MPI divided by MPS plus MPI. For transfer payment multiplier, it is almost identical without the negative sign. MPC minus MPI divided by MPS plus MPI. So let's look at an examples. So here's the numerical examples. We are told that the government has a fiscal stimulus. Fiscal stimulus means it is intended to, so fiscal stimulus, let me just write. So fiscal stimulus. So that means these are fiscal policy fiscal policies that are intended to increase aggregate demand, stimulate aggregate demand. On the other hand, if we have a fiscal constraint, then those are fiscal policies that are designed or intended to lower, to decrease the aggregate demand. Okay? So we have let's go back to the example. We have a fiscal stimulus here, which is 100 billion. The government spending increases by 100 billion, and that is intended to increase the aggregate demand. We're given the marginal propensity to save. We're also given the marginal propensity to import. So the spending multiplier is 1 over MPS plus MPI. Let's find the effect on the aggregate demand. So why don't you pause the video and then spend a few minutes working on this problem. I hope you've spent some time solving the problem. So now let's look at it. We're given the change in government spending, which is $100 billion. And then we can calculate the spending multiplier, 1 over MPS plus MPI. So that will give us 4. So the product of these two should give us $400 billion. So what that means is when the government increases the government spending by $100 billion, the aggregate demand increases by $400 billion at the end with the multiplier effect. So let's look at it graphically. So we have learned many times that this a rightward shift illustrate an increase in aggregate demand. So that's what we have. Initially, we have 81, and then with an increase in government spending, we should expect to see an increase in aggregate demand. So that is a rightward shift. And we now have the new aggregate demand curve, and we found that the aggregate demand increases by $400 million. So that is represented by the horizontal distance between these two aggregate demand curves. Once again, I usually like to put it here because it shows the initial price level. You don't have to do that. As long as it is a horizontal distance between the two aggregate demand curve, that will do. Okay. So now let's look at the second example. So this time let's turn to the income tax. So once again, we are given a fiscal stimulus. So this is a tax cut, okay? A tax cut. When we're dealing with tax cut in this classroom setting, we deviate a little bit from the reality. In reality, in the United States, what we have, the kind of income tax system that we have is what we call the proportionate tax system or the marginal tax system. So what that means is the income tax rate, how much, the fraction of income that we have to pay depends on our income tax bracket. The higher income we earn, the higher the tax rate, the larger the fraction of our income is paid in the form of taxes. So that is a marginal tax system. So that makes our calculation a little bit more complicated. So since we're just starting to get familiar with these kind of calculations, we will simplify things a little bit by assuming that the income tax is actually a lump sum income tax system. So here in this case, for example, we have an income tax cut of $100 billion. So what that means is almost like the government gives back $100 billion to the economy, regardless of the household income. Okay? So altogether, household members in this economy get back $100 billion. So this is almost like an increase of $100 billion in disposable income. Okay? So a lump sum income tax cut of $100 billion, and we're given the marginal propensity to consume, we're given the marginal propensity to import. Okay, so let's spend some time to find the total effect on the aggregate demand. Why don't you pause the video and then work on this example a little bit. Okay, let's take a look at this. So let's first calculate the income tax multiplier. MPC, the negative of MPC minus MPI divided by MPS. As we have previously learned, we can calculate marginal propensity to save by using 1 minus MPC. So that would give us 0.15. And then plus MPI. So negative MPC minus MPI divided by MPS plus MPI. So that would give us a income tax multiplier of -3. So when you plug into the equation, the total change in aggregate demand is equal to the income tax, the change in income tax, multiplied by the income tax multiplier. So that will give us $300 billion. Okay, so when the government cuts the income tax by a lump sum amount of $100 billion, the aggregate demand will increase by $300 billion. Okay, so when you look at the graph, I'm sorry, there's a typo here. It should be, okay, all right. So similar to what we have just observed, now you can see that with an income tax cut, the aggregate demand increases. So that's a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. And the horizontal distance between these two aggregate demand curves will give us the total change. That's the $300 billion.